Denise Simmons from the University of North Texas. That was excellent and intellectually stimulated. And I have two questions, but maybe I'll only ask one. Just in terms of reaching what you're calling the public, would you consider that the masses? And if that's true, then how would you engage the masses given the language of, let's just say, the humanities? And I'll give by example the NIH, which requires its funded researchers to write a 3-sentence narrative. Now I believe they've upped it to 5th grade level. So language of a 5th grader, would you say that something like that would need to be included if it's the masses you're trying to reach?
Okay, so am I trying to reach the masses? I'm not entirely sure how I would define the masses, but I do think that there is a much, much broader intellectual public out there that we are currently not reaching, that we should be reaching. And I base this on experiences on listservs that are devoted to particular sort of high literature authors, right? One thinks of as being extremely difficult and sort of the province of scholars, and these listservs have thousands of members who are actively engaged in really, really serious discussions about the work that they're reading that are not at all academic in nature, but are driven by a kind of personal investment and interest. It's not going to be the entirety of the US that we reach with this, or the entirety of the world by any stretch of the imagination, but there is a much broader public that would care about a lot of the stuff we're doing.
So I imagine your tax base, for example. So federally funded opportunities come from the general population and the tax base. That's what HHS does, or the White House. So now I really am, when I'm thinking the masses, I really am thinking our tax base. Right.
So I do think that this work, that particularly anything that's publicly funded, should be publicly accessible. I do believe that there is a time and a place for a kind of professionalized language, right? The language that isn't necessarily at the 5th grade level, that is engaged in specialists within a field communicating with one another. But I think we would do ourselves an enormous service if we were able to sort of have moments in which, and maybe it's that 3-sentence abstract that's describing the project, in which we really do attempt to speak more broadly with the public to get them to understand why it is we do this stuff and why we care, right? Research that's being funded by the NEH, we know why the public cares about that. They have things that diseases in their family that they're attempting to get information about, and if they can read the 3-sentence abstract, they'll have a better sense of what it is they need to take a look at. I honestly believe that work across the academy has that same kind of importance for people's cultural lives, if not necessarily their health, and that we can help create a much more thoughtful public if we can actually kind of show them the work that we're doing in a way that isn't speaking down to them. I don't know about a 5th grade level, but that is attempting to reach out and speak in a commonly accepted vocabulary that demonstrates the importance of the work that we're doing. So I think there's absolutely call for that.
I'm Sandy Thatcher, retired director, Penn State University Press. Actually, I would give a somewhat different answer to that question in emphasizing that there's a whole intermediary body of people out there, including journalists, who will take, with the access to that specialized knowledge, they will retranslate it into the kind of discourse that the masses can actually, and that's a process that also works in textbook publishing. The people who write textbooks get the specialized knowledge from the scholars, which they then translate down into the level of people who can read the textbooks and understand them and use them. Now, my question to you is, I wish there were a lot more administrators in this audience, because the problem as I see it is this: university presses are not going to go towards an open access model until university administrators free them from the requirement to recover 90% of their operating costs from sales in the marketplace. And that's why university presses generally are not very enthusiastic about open access as a model for book publishing or even journal publishing at this point in time. they are banking all of their money right now on the addition of ebooks to the journal aggregations like Project Muse and JSTOR and so forth, because that's all subscription-based, and that's where they hope that they're going to be able to sustain the business model that depends on the market. They're not going to get to open access as long as they're still trying to fill that requirement in that way. Now, when I was president of the AUP back in 2007, I put together a statement, open access, and I was critical of the Budapest initiative, and I'll want to see your attitude about this, because I think it's constraining. That talked just about articles. It only talked essentially aimed at STM journal publishing. Didn't talk about books at all, put that entirely out of it. It also made a norm out of what we know as the CC BY license, okay, Creative Commons license, which only insists on attribution as the only requirement. I don't think that works for humanities. And the contrast here is that in science, so much of the communication is done in terms of numbers, right? Formulae, data arrays that are all use numbers. Translation of those is not a problem, okay? Now, for humanities, translation is hugely important. With a CC BY license, people who use that license give up entirely any control over the translation of their work into other languages. I think that's a huge giveaway by scholars in the area of humanities who should rightly be concerned about the integrity of their work when it's passed over into other languages. So I'd be interested in how you view the Budapest dominance, essentially. I mean, there are people out there who say that that's the only true open access there is. If you don't believe in CC BY, you're not an open access advocate.
So, Budapest. As I said, it just celebrated its 10th anniversary, and there was a sort of regathering of that initial group of authors and signatories to the original initiative in Budapest, with a slightly broader circle of people who were brought in for this discussion and thinking about where open access should be headed over the next 10 years. I was thrilled to be invited to attend that meeting, not least because I think it meant that the folks at the core of that mission sort of realized that the humanities were there, which is good. This is a problem across the research spectrum. Humanists are not understood on some very fundamental level as doing research. We have one of the more educationally oriented presidents in office right now, who talks about the importance of research, and whose Office of Science and Technology Policy has issued this directive on public access to the results of federally funded research. And yet it's all about STEM. Right? So we're kind of working to make sure that the humanities are at the table at these events, and that one of the effects of getting the humanities to the table is thinking beyond the journal article, right? Recognizing that there are other forms of publication, including the book, but also including some newer non-traditional forms that are beginning to circulate, that are extremely important to have in the mix in thinking about where open access is headed over the next 10 years. But in terms of thinking about the CC BY license, I will say that I am an advocate for it, and I have been somewhat reluctantly converted to that advocacy. I was initially, when I started releasing stuff under a Creative Commons license on my blog, I was using the buy and see license, right? That basically says that, stuff can be recirculated, but not for commercial purposes, right? You can do anything with it without asking me, but if you were a commercial publisher and you're planning on selling this thing, you have to ask me first, right? I have been encouraged to let that go by Bethany Novisky, who has a brilliant blog post defending the CC BY license that basically says that commercial, in the terms that the license uses it, is much too broadly defined and excludes many, many more possibilities for the redistribution of our work than we intend to exclude. It doesn't just mean that Elsevier has to ask me if they want to reprint something. It actually means that a nonprofit publisher who's going to be selling something also has to ask me. And frequently, that act of having to ask is just enough for somebody to say, you know what, never mind, I'm not going to use this piece, right? So, and frankly, I'd much rather have the stuff recirculate than have it excluded because somebody didn't want to seek the permission. In terms of the question of translation, I definitely take your point. But on the other hand, speaking as a scholar, I would be concerned about the integrity of the translation, but also I would just be thrilled to have my stuff translated. And so if somebody wanted to take on all of that labor of translating it, I'm not sure I would want to restrict that energy and initiative. I have only had a couple of things translated at this point. They've been relatively small articles or blog posts, and I can't read the target language into which they've been translated, so I have no way of knowing whether the translations are solid or not. But I'm just happy to have the stuff circulating out there. This is me. Not every scholar is going to feel this way. I think the CC BY license has been somewhat enshrined, but I think there is a recognition that it's not the only way to go, and openness is going to allow for more possibilities, rather than fewer. If I can wrap that up without making too much sense.
I'm Brad Gulliford from the University of Texas at Arlington, and I actually specialize in the science and technology disciplines. But I'm very glad Sandy went first because made some very important points that that assimilated to it. I wanted to point out. I wanted to react a little bit to some of the sentiment put out a little earlier about open access puts stuff out to the masses. What I have noticed. It's not only just any Tom, Dick, and Harry, so you can get sort of crank comments to archive.org high energy physics papers, which they've worried about, and they do have a system to deal with. But it's also it increases just your regular your target scholarly audience to academics in poor countries that can't afford these monstrous journals. Many of us have gotten some really important zinger, have you thought of type things coming from somebody in the University of Bhutan or something like that. Or just, a second-year graduate student, even at a prestigious university, who does not have access to all the funding and prestige and talking to the right people type stuff that you do when you get further up. Also, what I have noticed, UT Arlington is trying to get more into community partnerships with things like the Town Chamber of Commerce or local engineering firms or construction firms or social workers in various city agencies or whatever. The other thing about open access is that it not only just lets impecunious people see it, but it really allows for just a much more convenient sharing across paywalls, which is now with more and more research and scholarship and publication and scholarly traffic being interdisciplinary and being not only across disciplines, departments in the university, but different entities, or even if it's another academic institution, but they don't pay for the same journal, you can't just share the article unless you have open access. So it just makes it just a lot easier to get things done that we've always been doing. But as Sandy pointed out, as I say, I'm involved in STEM, so everything is just, a couple of paragraphs and we're done most of the time. I recognize that books are sort of a big lump to pass through the scholarly communication GI tract. And also with digital objects more, that are even more sort of multimedia and maybe have sort of fuzzy boundaries about what constitutes a document, that's going to be something we're going to have to work hard on.
Indeed. I now have the image, that image of a snake digesting an elephant as the publication of a book process. Indeed. I mean, I think the book does present some special challenges that, as Sandy notes, presses are wrestling with, and that they're having to wrestle with precisely because of their cost recovery orientation that most campuses have placed them under. Certain presses have been experimenting with new modes of releasing books simultaneously in open access online editions and in print and EPUB for sale editions. And the experiments that I've heard of thus far have gone extremely well, that the open online editions have sort of driven traffic to the project in a way that has actually had the effect of increasing sales. So there, that won't work for every single text, but we do hope that there might be more experimentation that can find a way to get us around this problem rather than just simply saying we have to recover costs and therefore we don't have the room to experiment with this.
Yes, just a couple. Steve Griffin from the University of Pittsburgh, formerly National Science Foundation Program Director. Just a couple of issues with your talk regarding the origins of the open access movement. In fact, I believe it started really well before the Budapest meeting. Peter Suber has a wonderful timeline of open access, and recently in the discussion forum of the Global Open Access List, there was a rather elongated conversation of when it did actually begin. And a lot of people date it to 1999 for the Santa Fe Convention and the Open Archives, the beginning of the Open Archives initiative. And my other point is it took North American institutions a very long time to get on board the Berlin Declaration as a signatories. And
Absolutely.
in my talks with Jürgen Wren, who organized the very first Berlin meeting, it took really 5 or 6 years before the U.S. institutions. So the open access here in the U.S. has been really a drag on the open access movement overall.
That is absolutely true. I did elide a whole lot of prehistory before the Budapest Initiative, including a lot of really powerful and important experiments like Paul Ginsparg's, what developed into the archive server, right? In which at first folks in high energy physics and then a number of other fields that are related simply began sharing preprints with one another as a means of getting them into circulation much more quickly. So there is a whole lot of prehistory there. The U.S. has absolutely been a drag on the open access movement, and for a whole series of reasons, one of which is just simply that all this giving it away is not the American way, This is not how we do things. And particularly that orientation, I mean, the distinction that I was trying to draw between the sort of individualist mode of the scholar who produces something and puts it into the marketplace versus the communally oriented mode of sharing something with a broader culture that is attempting to communally, collectively advance is, I think, again, a sort of, well, I mean, it's the rugged individualist American outlook on us doing it by ourselves and on individual achievement that I think has really hampered the U.S. participation in the open access movement. The good news is that has begun to break, and we are beginning to see a great deal of change. And simply the fact that 26 federal funding agencies are in the same room together talking about how to figure this problem out collectively under the OSTP directive, I think is enormous. So I think things will accelerate from here.
Joan Lippincott, Coalition for Networked Information. Well, I'll also go back into history just as background. Probably in the mid-90s, my organization worked closely with ACLS on digital scholarship issues, and we had a great relationships, some conferences on digital humanities, et cetera. And then with a leadership change, which was a long time ago, that interest really just totally like dropped off the cliff. So what I'd like to know is that your position has gotten a lot of visibility, and everybody knows what you're doing in the field. So are you getting traction? Are the other scholarly societies in your sister organization, say in ACLS, coming to you and saying, how can we do this? Are you developing some cadre of like-minded people?
Thank you for asking. The AHA is currently doing a search for a new director of scholarly communication who's going to be doing some of the same stuff that I am on the historians end of the humanities spectrum. But we have had a lot of conversations with other scholarly societies who are interested in pursuing some of the kinds of initiatives that we've been working on. And one of the things that we're in the process of doing right now is thinking about phase 2 of the development of MLA Commons, where we're headed. We have a nice critical mass of members who are on the site now who have registered for accounts. I hope any of you who are MLA members will register for accounts. And if you're not members, I would be happy to help you become one. But, you know, and that's great. But almost within hours of launching the network, we had our first member send us a message saying, well, this is great that MLA members can join this, but I collaborate with somebody in the Society for Cinema and Media Studies. Can't she get an account on this network? Well, you know, no, it's a benefit of membership, and we need to keep it that way. Participation is the thing that we're trying to kind of work toward, the thing that enables us to kind of keep our members working with us and with one another collectively. But on the other hand, we do see the opportunity for collaborating with other scholarly societies in thinking about how our network and their network might connect and allow for some fruitful collaboration. So in phase 2 of MLA Commons, we are actually hoping to expand it into the Humanities Commons, to create a federated network of networks in which AHA members could join their network and SCMS members could join their network, CAA members join theirs, and members across those networks can collaborate in a common space where work that is interdisciplinarily humanities-oriented can be communicated. This would also enable, I think, because, you know, our memberships overlap with one another. There are a lot of SCMS members who are members of the MLA. And, you know, everybody's facing a kind of profile fatigue. Everybody's got their own non-communicating network that you need to actually participate in order to have the conversations that you need to have. And if you had one hub that had a single sign-on that allowed you to get access to all of the societies that you have a stake in without having to maintain a profile in each of them separately, it might foster a greater kind of communication. So we have been talking very actively with ACLS about how they might help us coordinate this process. And you know, cross your fingers for me. I'm hoping we're going forward with planning in the fall and a rollout soon thereafter.
All right, I think we have time for just one more. If anybody has any burning question they'd like to throw out, and we have a taker. Introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Doug Jones from the University of Arizona. Also, I'm chair of the Library Advisory Committee for the Optical Society, and publishing actually one of the earliest and longest standing open access journals. It seems to me one of the central themes that you suggested here was the change in the conversation from cost to value. And part of the understanding that change comes from understanding the costs themselves. And I'm always here with great trepidation the term free. Even a senior faculty member has, I mean, they have time, somebody's paying for their time. So it's really an allocation of personal resources, whether it's their time or a graduate student's time or hiring a managing editor or doing that. So there are costs to the system. It's just a matter of deciding how those are allocated. So as I say, I really cringe at the word free. I don't think any of it is free because we're all doing something or paid somehow. So I wonder if you could address that in terms of your cost modular, cost value conversation.
Mm-hmm. I think there are costs and there are costs in that kind of system. I mean, faculty members, and particularly tenured senior faculty members, are hired by their institutions and have in their contracts the desirability not just of teaching their courses and serving on their committees, but also of producing knowledge, whether it's through research and publication or through other kinds of service to the field, like editing journals. And so it's really, I mean, though it is a matter of time allocation for those faculty, that is part of what we are being compensated for by our institutions. When that kind of labor gets outsourced to graduate students, when we decide that, you know, we can create a TA-ship or an RA-ship that will have a graduate student take on this editorial role for us, it's because on some level the labor that's involved in producing that work is no longer seen as being professional. Right? It's something that is managerial. It can be done at a much lower level, and we're you know, decreasing by a lot the amount of the resources that we're willing to devote to that kind of labor. And so what I want to suggest is that we really need to think about keeping that work of producing this scholarship, of editing these journals, of doing peer review and so forth. We need to keep understanding that as professional work, that we are being compensated for, even if there is always the juggling act of allocating our time properly, rather than saying that it's something that we can simply outsource to underpaid and often undercompensated in the long scale folks who have increasingly been asked to take this kind of stuff on. I too, as I hope you heard in the talk, am leery of the term free when it comes to the notion of production. Because I think that I agree with you completely, this stuff simply cannot be produced for free. But distribution, on the other hand, need not cost us in the way that it has. And so thinking about where there is free and where we need to continue to support professional labor in the production of this work, I think is something that we need to look at extremely closely and extremely carefully. And this, in terms of the shift from cost to values, I think that when we get too focused on cost is precisely the time when we deprofessionalize and devalue the kinds of work that goes into producing scholarly publications. That in focusing on values, we need to focus not just on the value of getting the work out there as broadly as possible to the world, but also the value of supporting the people who are doing that work for us. So that's that.
Is this on? Why don't we please join me in thanking Kathleen for these thoughts. So we'll have a short break. We will reconvene at 10:15, so fill your cups or take a break, and we'll be right back.